how well does this actually work? Does this improve environmental conditions? Does it enable people to keep the livelihoods in the adjacent favela? Do they have a level of security of tenure? Do they have some sense that they share in the self-governance of the place and involved in the management?
Hi, this is Emily Holloway, and you're listening to UAR Remixed, a podcast by the journal Urban Affairs Review. In this episode, you'll hear from Doctors Zachary Lamb and Larry Vale, co-authors of the recently published book, The Equitably Resilient City, Solidarities and Struggles in the Face of Climate Crisis, from MIT Press. The Equitably Resilient City assembles 12 in-depth case studies that examine different planning and design approaches to equitable urban resilience in the face of climate change around the globe.
I'm Zach Lamb. I'm an assistant professor at UC Berkeley in the Department of City and Regional Planning. And my research is, broadly speaking, on where climate equity, so the kind of uneven impacts of climate change and adaptation to climate change meets urban planning and design, often with respect to affordable housing.
And I'm Larry Vale. I am in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT, where I am a professor and also Associate Dean of our School of Architecture and Planning. It's where I've spent my whole career looking at a variety of ways that the urban design world is connected to the socio-political world. And that has involved everything from studies of low-income housing to designed capital cities to disaster recovery to the challenges of the climate crisis.
Could you both talk a bit about the genesis for this book and your collaboration? What prompted you both to start thinking about planning and design for climate resilience through this framework of what you call LEGS, or livelihoods, environment, governance, and security?
So for me, this book is the culmination of a 20 plus year journey that started by focusing on a book called The Resilient City that dealt more about disaster recovery. And then which led, I think, to the founding of a group in 2012-13 called the Resilient Cities Housing Initiative at MIT that was trying to apply this notion of equity to questions of housing. And then, fortunately, Zach arrived in 2013 into the doctoral program, and we've spent more than a decade working together. But it was really an effort to recognize a shortcoming of my earlier work, which had really not dealt very centrally with the climate crisis, and to draw upon Zach's expertise in these kinds of environmental concerns and to figure out, why it was a good idea for us both to drop everything that we were otherwise working on. Zach to do a book based on his dissertation, which will be a great book when it does come, and me to leave some other projects in mid-course to say this is more urgent, and this kind of coming together of the challenges of urbanization, inequality, and climate crisis in a search to find some places that have handled that more equitably was worth prioritizing our academic lives.
When I came to MIT to start my doctoral studies, I was coming off of, I guess 8 years on and off of working in post-Katrina New Orleans. I started architecture school actually the fall that Hurricane Katrina hit in New Orleans. And so I'd gotten involved in a bunch of post-Katrina reconstruction projects during the course of my architecture studies. And then I had moved to the city and was working full time there for 4 or 5 years, mostly on kind of reconstruction efforts, largely around affordable housing. And I came back to do my doctoral studies because I was sort of perplexed by these larger questions of what was the future of the city going to be? How is this city that I had really come to love? How is it going to persist and thrive in this era of climate change, given the fragility that we had seen when the levees broke during Hurricane Katrina and the enormously uneven impacts of those levee breaches and the enormously uneven trajectory of reconstruction, right? That kind of followed the fault lines of class and race in New Orleans. And so I came back to do a PhD because I wanted to think about those kinds of questions of uneven resilience and uneven vulnerability. And so the opportunity to work with Larry on the Resilient Cities Housing Initiative, and then eventually a few years later to really focus on that work as a book project was really, really appealing to me.
So, who is the Equitably Resilient City for? What audiences or audience did you have in mind as you were writing this collection?
There's enough engagement with literature and theory to attract those who care about that, but enough focused on stories and action to be targeted to practitioners. One of the things that was so striking to me is about 4 days after the book came out on open access from MIT Press, I was contacted over email by someone working at an NGO in India who said she'd read the book and that it was something that really appealed to the NGO she was working at, and they realized that our story about Bangkok encouraged them to be in touch with other NGOs and to focus more on some of the livelihoods dimension that we talk about and the governance dimension that we talk about. Um, and and so that was, I think, a good sign that it was doing what it was supposed to do, and certainly a good reason to try and have a book that you can buy, but you could also bypass the world of Amazon and go direct to a free download from MIT Press for the open access version.
One of the things that we were aiming for was to make the chapters, to make the book both work as a whole, that one could start on page one and read to the end, and it would have a sense of forward momentum and growth and kind of cumulative impact, but also to make it legible if one were to assign a chapter at a time to an undergraduate course, for instance, or a specific case study for a course. So that was part of the vision.
There's been enormous political shifts in the months since your book was published in the fall of 2024, as we record this in April 2025.
So Obama's talking about all of this with the global warming and that, and a lot of it's a hoax. It's a hoax. I mean, it's a money-making industry, okay? It's a hoax.
The climate change agenda is a hoax.
It'll start getting cooler. You just watch.
I wish science agreed with you.
Hey, well, I don't think science knows, actually.
I feel it's necessary to put a timestamp on everything, since the news cycle is shifting so rapidly this year. But I think it's pretty clear that, maybe especially in light of these dramatic changes since January, this work is more urgent now than ever. How do you both feel about this research and its contributions under these political and cultural conditions?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that I've been thinking about as our kind of politics have unfolded. And we wrote much of this book really beginning the writing and the research process in earnest. I would say it was largely in 2018, right? And so the political moment was not entirely dissimilar to the current moment. And I think we really wanted to dig deep to tell stories about communities that were facing up to inequality and facing up to climate injustice and climate change vulnerability together, right? Where there were efforts to make places more resilient to climate change that were also recognizing deeply embedded inequalities and trying to redress those deeply embedded inequalities. And so, much of the work in the book spans scales, and it spans sort of primary actors. And among those case studies, some are national programs that are, in which national governments are really important actors, but many are small scale, community-driven efforts that um, that are really driven by the needs and desires and priorities of people on the ground. And so I think what we've seen over the last several months is, from my perspective, a real need to reinvest in local solidarities and then think about how those local solidarities connect us into wider networks that can bring bigger changes in the face of the kinds of hostilities and provincialism and retrenchment that we're seeing all around the world.
And we put in the subtitle Solidarities and Struggles. And I think what we were trying to suggest is that these were positive outcomes from pretty difficult sorts of struggles that took a lot of time, but they weren't perfect. And that this was um, an effort to try and tell partial success stories while being open to the challenges and the flaws. So it's not a book of marketing and boosterism for stories that are told only from the perspectives of their chief protagonist. It's an effort to approach difficult problems critically, respectfully, and to admire the capacity of the various people, whether it's community members or NGOs or design and development firms or government agencies, to work in various combinations, despite how difficult it is, and to persist in what in many cases are 20-year stories and challenges, and in many cases ongoing, and in many cases face setbacks. So in that sense, more metaphorically, it's a call for the importance of grounded work and an ultimate affirmation that things that are worth doing are not easy to do, and that we need that more than ever to do that. But we also don't want to just be naively saying, "Here's something that somebody else did and you can do it too," because it's really uh, it's really a difficult set of challenges.
So the book is organized into 12 different case studies that you sort by 4 broad themes: environment, security, livelihoods, and governance. And the geographies that you assemble are really incredibly diverse. We move from New Orleans, which, Zach, I know was really important to you, to Bolivia. We go from Portland to Shenzhen to Nairobi and San Juan, among many others. So how did you settle on this list? Early on in the book, you mentioned that there were nearly 200 different case studies that you had to pick from. How did you end up making those decisions?
It was a long process. So, we built out this list along with, we had an incredible group of research assistants who kind of worked with us over the years that we were researching and writing the book. And so we would meet at least once a week with that group, and we would sort of be on the hunt for these, what we were referring to as at least partial successes. So we were looking for places where there had been some progress, some meaningful progress, addressing core climate change vulnerabilities in human settlements that were bridging across both physical interventions and kind of institutional and social innovation across these 4 dimensions that are the core of the book: the livelihoods, environment, governance, and security. We were sort of trying to build out this, find as many of these kind of examples as we could around the world. And again, we're seeking kind of diversity across a lot of different dimensions. So both across those 4 dimensions, but then also we were looking for cases that were, geographically distributed. We were looking for cases that were in different types of settlements and different types of cities. We were looking for cases that were dealing with different types of climate threats. So not just flooding threats, but also heat or drought or fire, right? because we recognize that what climate change means in different communities is very different, and what those impacts mean and what inequality means in different cities is very different. So we wanted to make sure that we were gathering and ultimately landing on a group of 12 case studies that would really represent something of that diversity and pluralism, in terms of both the kind of contextual situation and also the actions that we were interested in highlighting.
And I would just add that we didn't lose all of the other 188 examples, but I think they were, in many cases, infused briefly into the way we framed the cases that we did focus on. And the other thing I would add is that we were being pretty careful about the time dimension of this. We wanted places that were far enough along in their trajectory so that we could have some capacity to judge not just the great aspiration, but some sense of the fulfillment of high hopes. And at least in one case, far enough along for those high hopes and extreme efforts to be thwarted by pushback. A story of a women-led collective in Bolivia on the outskirts of Cochabamba, for instance, is a story of tremendous leadership among a group of women to really build a collective governance and collective land ownership of a territory, only to have a group of male-led counter movement folks upend the governance that had been planned and had been executed, still yielding a pretty well-functioning community even now. But it gave us a time frame that enabled us to say, okay, when can you really judge a partial success? And I think that was a rich component of what we've tried to do, because so often the idea gets credited, but not the execution and the implementation. And for anything that deals with planning and urban design and community development and economic development and international intrigue, like all of these cases engage, it matters. Following them along matters a lot to really begin to see how sustainable the effort is and what the challenges may be.
So the word resilience may be, at least for some, a neutral or maybe even a positive term when thinking about climate change adaptation or mitigation and planning. But in some circles, both inside and outside academia, it's pretty contested. And you spend some time discussing this in the introduction, unpacking these debates and also working to reframe the term and practices of resilience.
As you can imagine, we had many conversations about our relationship to the word resilience. Resilience is a deeply contested word in a lot of different kind of corners of particularly sort of academic debate, but also spilling out beyond scholarship. And it's a controversial term in part because the term has been embraced by an enormously wide set of actors, and in some cases it's been used to justify certain kinds of governance practices that can be really regressive, right? So rightfully, some critical scholars have said resilience is really just an excuse for saying the state isn't responsible, and we're going to put all the responsibility of adjusting to and adapting to and responding to climate change and other threats onto communities and individuals. People refer to this as a kind of neoliberalization of risk or a privatization of risk. And other people have said, resilience is just so malleable. It's just such a wide term. It can mean anything to anyone. And so there have been, very valid critiques of the way this term has been mobilized. In the end, we chose to use the word to embrace it, but not at all in a kind of in a unthinking way. We really spend quite a lot of time grappling with those debates and those criticisms. And we come to the place that many other scholars have also recently come to, which is to say that yes, there are valid critiques. Yes, this word has been used in ways that can be destructive or regressive, but there also is like tremendous power in the embrace of the term, in part because a lot of communities have embraced the word, and because it ties us to a sort of lineage of other thinking and scholarship. And so we wanted to kind of step into that conversation and say, we see real transformative and even kind of liberatory potential in this concept, and we want to sketch out the terms on which we think this idea of resilience can be a really powerful framing concept and normative aim. And so that was the aim and the goal of kind of staying with resilience and not jumping on the bandwagon of immediately upon hearing the word, pitching a fit about it.
Yeah, I think that's the key thing, is that we were trying to selectively rehabilitate uh, aspects of the term by asking, what if we looked more holistically at what resilience could mean, and what if we focused it on equity? And I think one of the things that we were really trying to do here is to take the conversation about resilience beyond the environment focus and beyond the explicit effort to, only focus on the vulnerability of residents, to say something about how they were vulnerabilized in the first place in terms of why they were in the places they were in. And that meant trying to understand the dimensions of resilience that are experienced differently by socioeconomically disadvantaged people, exposed to environmental risks and stresses. But then to really insist that it goes to the other dimensions of our framework. Not everything like the 22 categories that the 100 Resilient Cities folks at Rockefeller and Arup were doing, that sort of flattened it into, do lots of good things. But to say, okay, let's start with the environment, and then uh, to say that if you're reducing climate risk and improving hazard literacy and strengthening ecosystem health, that's all essential, but it doesn't do enough to benefit disadvantaged groups unless they have the security to resist displacement. So that gets us into questions of security. And then to be able to say, well, okay, uh, they now have the capacity to stay where they are with less environmental risk, but are they in the right place? Or if it's going to be lasting and equitable resilience, do they have the capacity for reliable and dignified livelihoods? So that then gets us into that set of questions. All too much housing is safe and distant from employment. That doesn't sound resilient. Finally, we were saying that it's not just secure housing and livelihoods in environmentally safe places, but really trying to figure out who exercises control over the development processes that get there, how legitimate that process is, and who has a voice in how those communities are managed. So this is an effort to get to questions of governance. And so once you have meaningful roles and capacity to have meaningful work in places where you're able to stay that are not dangerous to live in, then you have an ambition that truly warrants what we think equitable resilience can mean.
Thank you for that. So each chapter really provides a lot of rich detail. It's supported by a range of qualitative and quantitative methods and framed really carefully through the conceptual and applied frameworks of equity and resilience that you lay out in the introduction. Did any case studies really stand out as, particularly memorable or meaningful to you?
I'll start at the beginning with the first case in the book, which is a case called the Gentilly Resilience District in New Orleans, and this, as I mentioned earlier, I'd come back to my academic career um, in part because of my experience in post-Katrina New Orleans and trying to understand what the future of that city looked like and how the city was or was not effectively grappling with its vulnerability and its inequalities. And so this Gentilly Resilience District was and is an ongoing effort in the city to kind of rethink the relationship between urbanization and water in New Orleans, and a really ambitious effort. And it was a fascinating one to dig into. I knew a little bit about the case, and I knew a lot about the context from my previous research and my previous professional experience in the city. But to really dig into this ongoing effort, when we were doing the work in the book, we were about 6 years into that effort. But it was 5 or 6 years after the city had gotten a big federal grant, and we were talking to lots of folks across different dimensions of this project, from city officials to design and planning professionals to community groups, and to see where they were getting traction, where they were able to make progress, and where things had kind of run aground was really illuminating. And to really, and I think that's one of the important things about the cases in the book to recognize, is that while we were on the hunt for and found what we think are 12 really interesting partial successes, part of what makes them useful and interesting and cases that we can learn from is both where they've gotten traction, where they've really struggled to build solidarities, where they have made real tangible progress, and also where they haven't, where things have gotten held up or fallen backwards. And in the case of New Orleans, it was a case where there was a mayoral transition in the middle of this process, and that had sort of slowed down the implementation. And then there was fundamentally just one of the things that became clear over the course of studying this case was that it is much easier to implement a kind of infrastructural change on the ground than it is to reform the institutions that underlie and are linked to those infrastructures, right? So just briefly to mention, so in New Orleans, there's been about a century of investment and construction of both physical infrastructures like levees and pumps and mechanical drainage, and the institutions that wrap around those infrastructures, that operate those drains, that make sure those levees are functional and holding back the water. And the Centennial Resilience District was an effort to reimagine those infrastructures to use what is often referred to as green infrastructures, which are kind of landscape embedded ways to hold water in the city rather than ejecting it out of the city as quickly as possible. And what we were seeing was that things were moving along, in some cases reasonably well, on some of these efforts to design new infrastructures, but there really wasn't much of a sense of how this was going to work institutionally, how the sewage and water board, who was responsible for those giant pumps, and how the levee board, who was responsible for those concrete walls and earthen levees, how are they going to change their stripes to be able to become green infrastructure institutions? And so we had some really great conversations and interviews with folks across the spectrum there that kind of brought to light the disconnect between a kind of design competition vision for restructuring a city and the hard long-term work of remaking institutions to match those changes in physical form.
For me, the second case in the book, very different from the New Orleans one, is in São Paulo, Brazil, a favela known as Paraisópolis that I had visited in 2012 and seen both the operations of the favela itself with community members, but also visited this adjacent, nearly completed set of large modernist condominium projects intended to rehouse some of the favela dwellers who had been seen as living in the most vulnerabilized portions of it, particularly landslide prone areas and flood prone areas. And so the question, kind of revisiting it, was, how well does this actually work? Does this improve environmental conditions? Does it enable people to keep the livelihoods in the adjacent favela? Uh, do they have a level of security of tenure? Do they have some sense that they share in the self-governance of the place and involved in the management? And the reason I pick this out is not because they succeeded in all of these dimensions, but because the quest to figure out how do we study a place like that was very interesting. We had access to government officials who were planning the policy as well as architects and planners who were involved. But the thing that really made it work was through a Brazilian-based professor, we were able to track down a woman who spoke no English, who grew up and still lived in the favela, but had taken time out to go to architecture school and then returned. And she was able to do a lot of the on-the-ground interviews in Portuguese. And then we found two students at MIT that were Portuguese fluent, and one of them about to leave for a Fulbright in Brazil, who were able to really turn the insights of a person who spoke no English into material that we could work with so that we could feel that we had the voices of people undergoing this experience, not just the voices of the experts and the people who were leading it. And so that kind of thing, I think, mattered a lot for it.
So 12 case studies, not to mention the potential 200 that you pulled from. That's a major undertaking, even for co-authors. How did you navigate this, just practically speaking?
We were trying to do a book in 8 countries that had material collected in 9 languages. And without spending a lot of time and money on airplane flights to distant places in ways that were kind of exactly the opposite of what you would want to do for a project focused on climate crisis, we were able to leverage networks in situ where we could get the people who were more likely to really gain the trust of local communities and speak to the people in the local languages. And so when we say we had a team of research assistants that mattered, the current students and the alums from both MIT and Cal were really vital partners in this. And the thoughtfulness of their write-ups and contributions really come through on every page, as does the graphic talents that were deployed by some of them to help us visualize what we were writing about.
And what was it like co-authoring a book together?
I would underscore what a pleasure it has been to work with Zach on this project. Your question earlier about collaboration made me wonder whether if we tried this experiment, I don't know whether Zach, whether you've done this or not, but I haven't asked anybody, please read these 12 cases and guess which 6 of them started with a Larry draft versus a Zach draft. But I'm guessing that even our spouses would probably have trouble guessing. I'd done a dozen books before this. This is the first time I've ever co-authored a book. And for me, it allowed a level of consciousness about, how I write, because I was working with someone who did have more of a focus on structure and outlining in advance of chapters than I probably had done. Whereas I probably approached, more from let's get the story out and let's quote a lot from the people that we talk to and learn from. And as we edited each other's drafts, it seems to me that we found common ground to try to be as engaging as possible. We wanted this to be readable for people who wanted to get into arcane internal debates about the politics of resilience as a term, but also people who were on the ground working on difficult problems who wanted to see how others had handled that complexity. And to do that means writing clearly and being open to as many perspectives as possible in others. And I think in our writing process open to the way that each of us approached each of these cases.
Yeah, I'll second that and say it was a real pleasure to get to trust a co-author as thoroughly as I trust Larry with my words, and to have that process of knowing that when I sent him a draft, it was going to come back better, and that he would understand what I was trying to do. So we did build a real understanding of each other as writers, as thinkers, through the process of writing the book, and that was a really an amazing experience and pleasure to do. I think in the end, I sometimes have to kind of remember if I was the primary drafter on a chapter review, or I can't always remember when I look back at the text now. So I think that's probably a mark of some kind of success.
And after 12 years, we're still friends.
My thanks to Zach Lamb and Larry Vale, authors of the Equitably Resilient City from MIT Press, which is available open access. You can find a link to the book in our show notes. You've been listening to UAR Remixed, a podcast by Urban Affairs Review. Special thanks to Drexel University and the editors at UAR. Music is by Blue Dot Sessions. This show was mixed and produced by Aidan McLaughlin, and written and produced by me, Emily Holloway. You can find us on Blue Sky at urbanaffairsreview.bluesky.social for updates on the journal and the show. Please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.